Okay, good afternoon. So we're just waiting on a couple more, or a handful more. We've got a large contingent joining us today, which is wonderful, and welcome to our counterpart across the border as well. So more people will come in and in, but I might just kick off so we don't start and go too late. Welcome to the RSL Services Clubs Association Evolve webinar series. Today we'll be exploring anti-money laundering, latest developments and AUSTRAC assessment insights. My name is Margot Smith and I'm the CEO of the RSL Services Clubs Association, and I'm joined by Daniel Symond, Managing Director of Betsafe, and also Damian Hughes, the Group Gaming and Analytics Manager at Canterbury, Hurlstone Park RSL Club Limited, and we're all joining you here today from Canterbury, Hurlstone Park RSL Club Limited. Now, the spotlight has very much been on money laundering in the last few months, both in the media and also from regulators. And we at the RSL Services Clubs Association did support the joint submission into the New South Wales Crimes Commission Inquiry earlier this year, and we await the outcomes of that inquiry in coming months. But in practical terms, we did also want to bring to our member clubs and the broader network an opportunity to consider what we can do when it comes to AML CTF to get on the front foot and really take a beyond a ticker box approach, really try and look at best practice. So in practical terms, we did want to look at what we can do to minimise risks around money laundering and make sure that their clubs have their culture and programs doing what we proclaim them to do. So today we'll share some key things that you need to do to better ensure that you're meeting your obligations under AML CTF. I have had a couple of questions sent to me prior, but if there is anything else at the end and we have a little bit of extra time, just pop them into the chat box and we will take those on notice. But firstly, I'll kick off and ask Daniel and Damien some questions. And as I said, it's designed to be a practical session, so hopefully get something out of it. And okay, so Daniel, before we kick off, how many clubs do you work with? I assume you get a pretty good insight into how clubs are educating themselves and shaping their AML CTF programs. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, Margot. We work with a bit over 80 venues, predominantly located in New South Wales, but also a number of large clubs in the ACT as well. Most of which are the larger clubs. So we're talking about, gaming machines in the hundreds and generally operating more than one site as well through amalgamated premises. So I guess with AML CTF being risk-based, every venue is going to comply differently. Mm-hmm. And I guess the nature of risk-based legislation is that there's an element of subjectivity as well when you look at how a venue complies. So I guess working with the number of venues we do, we get a good insight in terms of how venues are meeting their obligations, and we're able to assist other venues and enable them to improve their programs through some of those insights. But I guess the best insight really is going through an AUSTRAC compliance assessment. And I know obviously we'll be discussing a bit about those a bit later on in the session. So that enables us to see, I guess, not just how compliant that particular venue's program is, but also, I guess, where the expectations are at from AUSTRAC's perspective. So given it's risk-based, given that there's an element of subjectivity, knowing where those expectations are really help both the club involved in the assessment, but also other clubs that we work with. Okay.
Bit of a, there's no cookie cutter, I think, is something we talked about before. You've really got to look at a fit for purpose for what your club is like. Definitely. So with that in mind, what do you think the key elements are that a club needs to put in place to comply with their AML CTF obligations?
I mean, we could list, the rules are 300 pages long. There are many elements, and I think we'll discuss a number of them today. But I guess the key thing is, well, firstly, you need a program that meets the requirements, so meets the rules. So making sure that you're ticking all the individual requirements, and I guess your starting point is your risk assessment, knowing what the risk level is of your business, and then tailoring your procedures accordingly. I think probably where a lot of venues get caught up is they may well have a fantastic AML CTF program that complies and meets all of the rules in the Act itself. However, it's not necessarily implemented correctly. So they are either not following their program, whether that be inadvertent or deliberate, but then also maybe not retaining evidence that they're following their program as well. So what I do see is, many clubs have great programs in place, and in many cases are actually following their program. But when it comes to the point where AUSTRAC is scrutinising that particular venue, it's important they're also able to substantiate the fact they're following their program. So retaining that evidence, and so by that I mean forms, I mean email trails, I mean checklists. That will really help the club demonstrate that they are being compliant. Okay.
So it's not good enough to set and forget, have the program in place. It's a live document and you need that ongoing evidence of you following it and everything.
Well, yeah, that's right. So not just, the evidence, but as you say, Margot, it's a live document. So where circumstances change, your program should change. Yeah. And not only to update it to ensure, you're compliant, but also to be able to illustrate to AUSTRAC that you made those changes at the point in time that they were required. So, things like if you're amalgamating with another club, if you're purchasing or selling gaming machine entitlements, if you're changing some of your designated services. So, for example, if you're implementing cashless gaming, that would be considered an additional designated service. So it's not just a matter of implementing procedures at an operational level. You need to update your program. You need to give consideration to risks that are posed by those matters, but then also be able to demonstrate to AUSTRAC that you gave that consideration at the particular point in time. So, for example, with an amalgamation, you need to assess the risk pre-amalgamation, and then you'd need to assess your combined risk post-amalgamation as well. And having that paper trail in place not only will help your business, but will help demonstrate to AUSTRAC that you've given that consideration.
Okay. So if a club has an AML CTF program, conducts regular reviews, provides regular staff training and lodges their annual compliance report, are they fully compliant?
Possibly. They're key items they need to be doing, but the devil's in the details. So I think a lot of clubs, they've got a program tick, they submit their compliance report tick, but they're not necessarily giving proper consideration to how all those things tie in with each other. So, for example, a club may well answer or provide certain responses at the annual compliance report, but they need to make sure that they are actually following what they're saying they're doing. And again, so they've got a procedure in place that underpins that. They've got evidence in place that they're actually following that procedure. Because I think, the compliance report's not just a way in which AUSTRAC can maybe prioritise which venues might be subject to a compliance assessment, but ultimately they'll probably be bound by that at a compliance assessment. So in other words, I think AUSTRAC may well say, you provided these responses at your annual report, provide evidence that you're actually doing that. So I think doing those things at a high level, yes, great, but I think the devil's really in the detail, and again, just making sure that there's that commitment to have the procedures, follow procedures, and really embed it into your workplace.
We might switch gears a little bit and talk practicalities. So, Damien, I understand you're unable to share the compliance assessment per se. Can you let us know the circumstances around the assessment that you had a few years ago? here at the club?
Yeah, so back in 2019, around mid-2019, we actually received a notice that we will be getting a desk audit, which was, so we'll probably explain more around the audits, but desk audit means that they didn't actually come into the venue. We basically requested information of us.
Okay.
So yeah, so with that, there was the majority of around our business processes.
Okay.
So they said, how would you handle this? What are you doing in regard to this situation? So we basically sent back our manual and our processes. And then from there, we went back and forth. So as Daniel's mentioned, it's good to have the program, but their thing was, okay, you've sent this through. This is how you're handling this. You know, show us evidence.
Okay.
So, you know, we show evidence of how we were doing our transaction monitoring or our check transactions or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So yeah. So that was.
So it was an iterative process where
they
were pressure testing what the program said did.
Versus, like I mentioned, they asked the question, how are you doing this? You've said it, now prove it.
Yeah.
I guess. And we're pretty lucky. We've obviously had a good relationship with Daniel for many years, and he's assisted us with the program. So we were in a pretty good place as it was. But even then, it was good to have a health check to see, you know, there's some things where we thought we were okay and maybe we weren't. There were some things we actually were doing that weren't actually in our manual that we had to add because when they asked for evidence, we showed them that, but we hadn't actually included into our manual.
Right.
So it was good to see and also see where we stand, because you always think that we're going all right, we do okay.
Yeah.
But to get that feedback was actually pretty good.
Okay, quite validating. That's good. Yeah. Was there any particular focus from AUSTRAC for the assessment, or was it more generalised?
It was pretty general. As I said, they sent out a list of things that they want to know how we handled. So it wasn't a particular subject, or it wasn't a particular show us you do this. It's basically very, very general. And then they picked from our responses and said, show us evidence of this.
Yeah.
So yeah, the initial was very general.
Okay.
So yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How long did it take all up?
The whole process probably took 6 months. So there was, like I said, there's a fair bit of back and forth, phone calls, emails. Obviously, you know, we have to gather the evidence that they require.
Yes.
So it's a process. You send it off, they review it, back and forth.
Yeah.
Then along the lines of there was some things that we need to update. So then you have to actually update your manual.
Okay.
And then you need board approval. So there's probably 6 months from start to finish. So obviously very front end, because that's where you're providing all the evidence and things like that. But yeah, probably 6 months.
Okay. So interesting. What key findings did the club itself acquire from having the assessment conducted?
I'd say there was a few things that stood out that we thought we were doing good, or we didn't. Sorry, it wasn't so much we weren't doing good. We weren't really aware of it. Yeah. Say the independent review. Yeah. So we Betsafe for a long time, and Damian was doing our reviews, but because Damian also helps out in our program, it wasn't considered independent. Yeah. So in previous, and Damian might talk to, he's attended things earlier that year where that wasn't a problem, and then we found out a bit later on. But now we've sourced a legal review to do our independent reviews. Yeah. So, and then obviously Damian can still, or whoever you're using, can still assist you for the actual manual. Yeah. So that was one thing that sort of stood out for us. A lot of it was language, to be honest. The way we worded things, I just wanted tweaked. And just, I guess, the other thing was training at all levels. Yeah. So, you know, we have training for our junior managers, we have regular training for our staff, the board. Yes. As mentioned, the board training. So basically having at every level of the organisation. Right. That was something that definitely stood out for us. And, you know, we do our monthly board reports where we give them AUSTRAC notifications and any updates from AUSTRAC as part of our reporting. Yes. But then getting more involved in the training and having more oversight over what's happening in terms of that space for AML-CTF. Yeah. So that was another good thing.
I guess interpreting those reports and understanding what they mean very much. So particularly when it comes to board level and everything. Yeah. Yeah. Or anyone, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Any recommendations to other venues with regards to their AML CTF program?
I probably, as I said, we have an independent review each year.
Mm-hmm.
That's always a good starting point. So it gives yourself sort of health check, tells you how your club's going, where you stand.
Yeah.
Because again, sometimes you think you're doing something good, sometimes not so good.
Yeah.
And obviously they're dealing with that situation, so they've got updates for you about how you should be handling situations or what might be the focus.
Yeah.
So I'd say get independent reviews. It gives you a health check, what you need to work on, just to see where you stand.
Yeah.
I think that's a starting point.
Yeah, absolutely.
And from there, obviously, goes on from that. But as we've mentioned, it's a live document, so it's constantly updating. We've recently done some changes in our designated services that had to be included into the manual.
Yes.
The training's constantly updated. We have updates from AUSTRAC website every month, so it's an evolution.
Yeah.
It's going to keep going for a long time. So yeah, just obviously, as you said, don't do your manual, put it in the shelf, and then that's it. It needs to be constantly updated.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, great. Thank you. We might come back to you, Daniel, and have a look at a couple of other questions. And as I said, if anyone has any questions, pop them through the chat box. And I've got another couple here. I think when we talk about there's been a few queries around lately, but how should clubs be responding from an AML CTF perspective in relation to recent scrutiny from state-based authorities?
Yeah, so obviously I'm assuming many participants here would have received requests from state-based regulators, and I think it's important maybe that we not discuss specifics, because I know that those particular regulators do not want us to discuss specifics. But from a general sense, obviously venues have been receiving requests for information in relation to certain transactions that have been occurring at their venues. Venues are complying with those requests, they're providing the necessary information. But I guess it's important that those venues recognise that that's not where, I guess, the responsibility ends, and there's AML CTF implications as far as those requests are concerned. So from a venue's perspective, if you're able to put yourselves in a position where you can identify those transactions before you're alerted to them by the regulator, that will really help you. It will help demonstrate that you're satisfying your AML CTF obligations, but also that you've got the necessary procedures in place. If those types of transactions are transactions you haven't previously identified or assessed, you will need to obviously review your risk assessment. You will need to make sure that your risk assessment is properly identifying and mitigating those risks. So from a mitigation perspective, that might include training of staff, either providing additional training, reviewing your training material to alert them to the fact that maybe new types of transactions or transactions that hadn't previously been identified are occurring, and maybe differentiate those from some of the other transactions they might have traditionally looked for. But also, some back of house procedures, particularly transaction monitoring. So utilising your gaming system to assist in identifying some of those transactions. And then obviously once you've done all those things, making sure they're reflected in your AML CTF program. So you've put the hard work in, you've assessed the risk, you've mitigated the risk, you may as well take credit for it. So you may as well update your program to specify the steps you've undertaken again, so that in the event you're subject to scrutiny in the future from AUSTRAC or that state-based regulator, you can show that you've not only complied and provided the information you've needed to, but you're actually mitigating the risk on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, there was some things to come out of that we've set up procedures and alerts that have flowed into our AML CTF program and the way we do things. So yeah, we use our gaming system, as I mentioned, so to set up parameters to trigger alerts for us so we can investigate those pretty much. Every morning we get an email if there has been any situations.
Okay, so an automated process, so pretty quickly.
So you review, you do an SMR or ECDD based on what you see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's actually quickening up that process rather than waiting for other ways to find out about issues on our floor. We find out pretty much either instantaneously from training or next morning from our system. So
you're in the driver's seat. Why is it important for clubs to lodge suspicious matter reports? Let there be light.
Let it lie.
Do you want to answer that first, Damien?
Sorry,
why is it important?
blinded by the light.
Why is it important for clubs to lodge suspicious matter reports?
Well, obviously you're showing on one side you've got evidence-based, that you're following your program and you're reporting any suspicious matters, and we always err on the side of caution.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's a thought, would it be? Then it is.
Yeah.
I guess so it's important, like I said, to show evidence. It's also important, obviously, there's a reason we do SMRs. There's a reason AUSTRAC required them.
Yes.
There's a bigger picture there in terms of it's not just something for us to do each morning. It's obviously leading to something for AUSTRAC and the whole reason for them being there.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd say that. I'll let you feel wrong.
No, I agree. I'll reinforce that. So yeah, it demonstrates you've got procedures in place. So you've got mechanisms to identify the transaction in the first place. So when we talk about evidence, an SMR is one form of evidence document. So the fact is you identified the transaction, you followed your program, you escalated to AUSTRAC in accordance both with your program and your obligations. So therefore, that's evidence in itself of your program. And your second point, you're required to. So under the Act, under the rules, you're required to lodge SMRs. And really, I think probably in the last 5 or so years, there's probably been a bit of a change in mentality, and you touched on it, Damien, about erring on the side of reporting. That maybe some years ago there was a tendency to be satisfied that money laundering was occurring, and really through some of the educational things that AUSTRAC have done in the last 5 or so years, it's become clear that there's an expectation to report apprehensions. So it's not the club's job to verify money laundering has occurred. It's not the club's job to necessarily investigate it to the extent that they're satisfied money laundering has occurred. It's the club's job to report the apprehension. So by doing that, you're minimising your risk as well, because that's your obligation. So you can illustrate that you fulfilled your obligation.
Are clubs required to discontinue a business relationship with patrons who are identified laundering money?
Good question. And obviously it would depend on the individual circumstances, but I think, and a number of, no doubt, participants would have attended recent educational meetings with AUSTRAC. And for many, that's been a bit of a focus of late. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion in around, for clubs specifically, constitutional requirements, procedural fairness in and around how they can practically discontinue a business relationship. I guess going to the rules firstly, the rules as part of the enhanced customer due diligence requirements require the club to give consideration to discontinuing the business relationship. So there's no explicit requirement to discontinue a business relationship with an individual, but certainly there's a requirement in certain circumstances to give that consideration. We talk about evidence, so therefore venues should ensure that there's evidence that they've actually given that consideration. Secondly, it will depend on the individual circumstances of both the transaction and the patron themselves as to whether or not that is the appropriate course of action. And part of that might be underpinned by your AML CTF program. So bearing in mind the rules say one thing, if your AML CTF program says you will, then you must, because under section 82(1) of the Act, you're required to follow your program. So if your program stipulates that you will discontinue your business relationship, then you may need to. But certainly, based on a number of the discussions with AUSTRAC at these meetings, what's clear to me is that there is an expectation to be strongly giving that consideration for patrons who are clearly laundering money. So we're not necessarily talking about these erring on the side of reporting transactions. There are certain transactions where clubs will be pretty certain that money laundering is occurring. And where that's happening repeatedly, I think there is an expectation from AUSTRAC that a very strong consideration be given to doing that. And I guess if a club can demonstrate an instance or a number of instances where it has taken that action, it will benefit. And again, that would be evidence in itself as well. So it's certainly something that's been discussed a lot lately. And I think clubs should be well aware of their obligations and being giving some thought to that.
Is that something, and this is a left field question, I don't know the answer, is it something that clubs can engage with AUSTRAC to ask them that question?
Yes, you can ask them. And we have had a club that has asked them.
Yeah.
But again, AUSTRAC will not necessarily advise you that you must, and they will, they will advise you. They're providing general advice.
Yes.
They gave some useful advice in terms of what may need to be done, but ultimately they will essentially say to you, it's dependent on your program. Sure. And your risk and the risk of the individual. And really, I guess you probably would expect that to an extent. But what I will say is that AUSTRAC put out some good guidance at the end of last year in around discontinuing a business relationship or discontinuing a business relationship. Some of the feedback Betsafe has provided to AUSTRAC, but also a number of the venues we work with through these educational sessions is providing some club-specific guidance about that, so that clubs can ensure that they're satisfying their constitutional and procedural fairness obligations, because a club's very different to a bank, a pub, a casino. Those businesses can refuse to admit an individual and do not necessarily need to explain the reason why. If you're a member of a club, there are certain rights that member may have. So AUSTRAC are aware of that, and I believe they are looking to put together some club or industry specific guidance in that regard, and I think that would be useful.
I mean, we talked before about how compliance is not a one size fits all. What are the key differences from club to club about AML programs? Is it scale, or from club to club, how does it differ? Yeah,
I mean, I guess, there are many similarities because many clubs are complying with their state-based obligations. Many clubs have similar constitutions. So there'll be, particularly in certain jurisdictions or state jurisdictions, there'll be a lot of similarities in terms of how they comply with their obligations. So I guess, when you're developing or when you're putting together an AML CTF program, ideally you don't want to reinvent the wheel too much. So you want to look at what your business is currently doing. What are your legislative obligations? And while some of those obligations are in place for reasons other than AML CTF, they assist a venue to mitigate the AML CTF risk. So, and same goes with the internal procedures. So clubs will have internal procedures. If you're talking about something like employee due diligence, they might be conducting criminal checks on certain employees for their own business reasons. But the fact they're doing that assists from an AML CTF perspective. So it's important that the AML CTF program includes those measures. And whilst that might not be a specific example of what you were referring to, Damien, I think that was your message earlier on. There are things that you're doing that you may not necessarily think they're AML CTF related, but they help from an AML CTF point of view. So you may as well put them in your manual and demonstrate that you are meeting the obligations. So So, yeah, to answer your question, Margot, obviously every business will be different. There'll be different circumstances from a club perspective. There'll be different locations, different sizes of groups with sites they're operating, maybe individual sites within a group that have perhaps different risk levels given their locations and other factors. So those things will obviously factor in terms of how a club needs to comply. So, yeah, in a nutshell, yeah, there are a lot of similarities, but there will be differences, and it's important that clubs are ensuring that those differences are reflected in their program.
Okay, interesting.
I think we discussed previously that obviously everything's evidence-based.
Mm.
So, you know, you can develop this awesome program. I mean, obviously the program needs to be compliant, but then, like I said, there was some stuff that we were doing that we didn't actually filter into AUSTRAC, but we've added to our program. But and we've found, especially over the last 6 months with other requests from other authorities, it can be very time consuming. So obviously you want the program to comply, but make it so that you have the resources or you have the capability to do so. Because there's no, you know, you don't want a program that's going, we do this, we do this, we do this, we do this, and then you don't have the bodies or the resources to do it.
Yeah.
Or, you know, you don't have the systems in place to do it.
Yeah.
So obviously it needs to comply, but just as we've said, sort of don't
make sure it's doing what it says
exactly
it's doing.
right, yeah.
And I think that's what we keep coming back to from a, and I guess that's around what's fit for purpose for your club or clubs is what you can actually implement.
Yes. Yeah.
Whether it's systems or people and resources and time and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, absolutely, point taken.
And just to extend that point, yeah, putting something in that sounds really good and not doing that is going to be a significant issue in the event that the venue is subject to a compliance assessment. So not that I encourage anyone to undercommit because there are issues with that as well, but you need to find that happy medium between not undercommitting, not overcommitting, documenting, and doing exactly what you say you'll do, because it can be tempting, I think, to put in things that sound really nice, but either will not be done, or, as I said earlier on, cannot be substantiated that they're being done. Yeah. And that might be just as bad. So you may actually be doing the procedure, but you can't substantiate you're doing the procedure, and that might cause issues as well. So, yeah, I agree with all that entirely.
Okay. Let's talk culture. So we've got the manual, we say we've got the evidence, training, all of those sorts of things. In terms of what's actually happening in the club, on the floor, you know, how do we ensure that everything we've done from those perspectives is what's actually happening day to day?
Yeah. First of all, back of house is pretty easy because it's system-based.
Yeah.
And obviously I receive all the same thing. Email alerts. So every time a ECDD or a SMR has been submitted, it comes to me because I'm also the compliance officer as well. Yeah. So that evidence and that notification, like I said, the system's in place for that. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, the training and the culture has to come from the top. So we mentioned before about board training, board awareness, then down to your leadership team, line management team, your floor staff. It needs to be, I guess, a message that comes all the way down. To staff training. It's also that with that culture, it's also letting staff know that it's okay to let you know. Do you know what I mean? They're not, the staff, it's a big, I saw putting money in a big customer, I didn't want you to lose. Like, no, we need to know that stuff.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So having that culture where they can approach a manager or they can approach yourself to notify you of something they found suspicious.
Yes.
And having the training to then see the sites and then see the signs, and then then being allowed to come and actually speak to you about it.
Yes.
So that's with the culture, that's a big one for us. We have to see something, say something. I'm sure it's used a lot of places, and that goes across the whole business, not just suspicious behaviour, but putting that in place so they feel confident to come and let you know, I guess.
I agree. Culture is really important. I mean, I guess what AUSTRAC, what any regulator wants is that AML's embedded in the business. It's not the business has said to Damien, hey, Damien, this is your baby. Make sure we comply, but, we're too busy doing other things to be involved. So AUSTRAC want to know from the board down, including senior management, that really AML's embedded in the business. Everyone knows their obligations, everyone's aware of their obligations, everyone's following their obligations, and the venue takes it very seriously. So you know, board training, and again, I think that was one of the takeouts from these recent educational meetings that many of the venues had with AUSTRAC is to do board training if the venue hadn't. I think it fulfills two purposes. A, assist them in understanding their obligations and I guess the business's obligations. But B, you know, really demonstrates, I guess, that there is that culture there at the venue. The fact that the board has undertaken training in itself, I guess, is evidence. So I think definitely making sure the board's involved, making sure they're aware of what their and the club's obligations are. I think that will better assist in terms of that culture flowing down to people on the floor. And as you said, Damien, at the end of the day, staff on the floor need to be reporting anything that they're suspicious of, and they need to be confident that there'll be no ramifications
and there'll be action that come out of it too.
Absolutely.
So having that loop that goes back to them to let them know that you've, you know, because if anything, if people tell you stuff and you don't act upon it or they don't know about what happened, then eventually they stop reporting. Or they stop letting you know. So having that continuous loop also to let them know what's happened or the outcomes of it.
Great. Okay.
What you can, in terms of what you can tell them, obviously, but
Yeah. So being quite overt with, you know, we're not just, we are walking the talk here. This is something that, you know, we want you to report. You're going back to them and saying, this is what steps I took and what the outcome is where appropriate.
Yeah, just so they know. I mean, obviously you don't have to go into details, but just so they know that something's actually come out of what they've told you.
Yes.
I was just thinking while we're talking how important the training is and that culture. I mean, everyone knows clubs, RSA. It's everyone knows the obligations. It's just embedded in everyone knows when it comes to RSA what they need to do and that sort of stuff. I guess getting to the, you know, we're not at that stage yet, but you know, in time, having that same sort of just embedded for the AML, CTF and other, you know, obligations, so it just becomes
second nature.
Second nature. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Often we're preaching to the converted around compliance and those sorts of things. How do we get key stakeholders to engage with training at a deeper level?
Do you want to ask?
With the, like I said, top down from the board.
Yeah.
It's got to come from the board. They've got to be involved. They've got to be, you know, engaged in what you're trying to do, and it's got to filter down from there.
Yeah, I guess just ensuring the training is relevant, right? So, you know, there are many clubs probably that are doing training, great, they've ticked that box, but the training's the same it was 10 years ago. They haven't reviewed it, they haven't updated it, they haven't made it relevant to current circumstances. Again, they look at it as a tick and flick sort of exercise. So I would probably bring that partly back to culture at that particular venue. But so, yeah, I think definitely, as you mentioned, Damien, starting you know, from the board down, making sure everyone in the business is aware of their obligations, but everyone in the business is aware of their specific obligations as well. So the training you do for the board is going to be entirely different to training for duty managers, which will be quite perhaps different to your training with general staff. So making sure that the individual roles are familiar with their specific obligations so that you can meet your needs. But I guess, you know, when you talk about engagement as well, I think some of this recent activity from AUSTRAC has been very helpful. I think with these meetings that AUSTRAC has been having with the industry, I know that many of the clubs we work with said, well, look, it's just great to be able to put a face to the name. So, you know, I know that there's an increasing level of engagement from the regulator as well. And that in turn, I guess, trains or educates venues and the staff that are involved in those meetings as well. But yeah, I guess back to my original point is just making sure the training is relevant. You're continuously reviewing it, you're updating it. If there's changes to different types of risks, such as what we discussed, you're updating your training content so that A, staff are aware of that, but B, you can demonstrate to AUSTRAC that you've got that continuous improvement.
And probably using some case studies to make it interesting and engaging and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, look, you know, I said it before, AML is not the most sexiest topic, right? So anything you can do to make it more relevant, more interesting for staff, absolutely. And I think, yeah, case studies really help in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. We have had a few questions. So I'll start with one here. How do you have a procedurally fair meeting to expel the member when you're not allowed to tell the reason is money laundering because of the prohibition on tipping off the member under section 123 of the AML legislation?
So, and again, I alluded to AUSTRAC's guidance that they provided late last year in around tipping off, and I guess that my response and my guidance to the venues that we work with is to focus on the behaviour, not why you think they were undertaking that behaviour. So, for example, loan sharking, buying tickets and credits. So, a good first step is to review your gaming machine playing conditions or rules and make sure that there are rules preventing the sorts of common behaviours that you may need to take disciplinary action in relation to. And then again, if you're focusing on the breach of rules rather than why they were undertaking that behaviour, the advice from AUSTRAC is you will avoid activating the tipping off provisions of section 123. So we're not interested in why they were purchasing that ticket, whether it was money laundering or not. The fact is you purchased a ticket and that is a breach of club rules. So AUSTRAC have advised that it is permissible to disclose that sort of information without discussing why they were undertaking that behaviour, mentioning SMRs or even mentioning AUSTRAC themselves. So that would be my advice in terms of how that's dealt with.
No, well, obviously we've had previous discussions, and that was the advice that we took on board, because it has been hard in terms of, as you mentioned, you can't mention AUSTRAC, you can't mention tipping off, you can't mention SMR. So Daniel's point, focusing on the behaviour, but then again, if you need to have the rules of your playing your machines, so then your staff can also refer to that as well. Do you know what I mean? So, focusing on the behaviour, not the reason for it, probably the way around it.
Okay.
As Daniel says.
Thank you. We had another question. As we can only pay up to $5,000 in cash, is there any circumstance where a club would have to submit a threshold report with AUSTRAC disregarding TAB transactions?
So, that's right. So TAB obviously are not a designated service of the venue. That's Tabcorp's responsibility. So again, we talked about state legislation mitigating risk. Obviously, under the game machines regulation, you can only pay up to $5,000 in cash for an individual prize. Advice from AUSTRAC has confirmed that a threshold transaction would relate to a single transaction or cash transaction of $10,000 or more. So in essence, a club in New South Wales and the ACT, I assume in other jurisdictions, will never be required to lodge a threshold transaction report to AUSTRAC, even if they've got multiple transactions totaling more than $10,000 in cash. AUSTRAC would consider they're separate transactions. It's not an accumulative transaction. So the answer would be no. I'm aware that a number of clubs towards late last year received calls from AUSTRAC where either they had lodged threshold transactions or AUSTRAC were just educating the industry more generally. And they essentially said, do not lodge threshold transactions with us because you're not required to. AUSTRAC obviously dealing with large volumes of transactions and presumably don't wish to be dealing with reports that aren't necessary in that regard. The other item I'll mention on that, and it's important, and clubs that are submitting SMRs will be aware that when you do lodge an SMR and you enter the value of the transaction, and if that value exceeds $10,000, it's actually an automated flag after the report is submitted asking whether or not a threshold transaction needs to be lodged. So obviously, given what we just discussed, the answer would be no, but that, as I say, is solely an automated flag where AUSTRAC says, well, we've noticed that the value of the transaction was $10,000 or more. Do you need to lodge a TTR? So don't necessarily see that and assume that you need to lodge a TTR. If in doubt, call the AUSTRAC contact centre, but I can't think of a scenario where a venue will need to lodge a TTR, assuming their designated services are gaming machines. If they're providing other designated services, currency exchange, gold bullion dealing and the like, then that might be a different story.
Okay, I have another question and an answer because I sought external advice. I'm going to read it verbatim. So it's a question about PAYID or how PAYID can reduce money laundering risks and how such a facility provides for instances where a patron seeks to direct an EGM payout to a bank account the patron controls, but that is not in their personal name. A patron that nominates to direct an EGM payout to a bank account in the name of its business or company. The question says, gaming machines regulation number 26 requires that a club to pay if the person so requests by means of electronic funds transfer, if those means are available to the hotelier or club to an account nominated by the person. With the above reg in mind, can the club deny a patron's request to pay to a bank account in the name of its business or company, etc.? So thank you to Arj from Thompson Kia. To answer the question, I don't think you can deny a patron's request to pay to a bank account in the name of its business or company, whilst it may be good to include a protocol for increased use of PayID to check accounts, etc. I'm not sure it would make a huge difference where the name of the bank account doesn't match the person. For example, Jane Bloggs gives her mobile number under PAYID, but the bank account to which that number is connected is the company named whatever. How would a club be able to ascertain whether it's in fact the correct amount for her? From a club perspective, the priority becomes to keep a record of the request so that it is clear that the amount was paid into the correct account nominated by the patron. So thank you to Arj for that response. I think, Daniel, from a practical or operational perspective, what would we need to consider from AML CTF policies there?
Yeah, so obviously I'll leave it up to individual venues to determine whether or not they should conduct the payout, but particularly based on Arj's advice. But I guess if there's a level of concern that the bank account is either not in the name of the customer themselves or maybe controlled by another individual, then there might be elements of the AML CTF program that need to be activated to give further consideration. So, for example, perhaps conducting enhanced customer due diligence on that customer to ascertain whether there's any other factors as to why they may be seeking to have that payout made to another account, assessing that customer's risk, and then giving consideration to whether or not an SMR needs to be lodged if there's a level of concern about that transaction as well. So yes, you may be complying with the game machines regulation by doing that or not doing that. But again, giving consideration to the AML CTF exposure. And I think probably going back to my earlier point about embedding AML into your business. So, it's easy to have your blinkers on and think, okay, it's only compliance with our game machine regulation obligations, but there's flow on to AML CTF, and then so it's making sure you're satisfying all your obligations there, I think is important.
I was going to say the first thing we do is an ECD, and then out of that, that'll pretty much determine what our next steps would be. So
yeah, an ECD. Good. So we don't seem to have any more questions at the moment. So we'll wrap up in a minute. I think to summarise some of the key things you need to address to ensure or best ensure that you're meeting your obligations under AML CTF are an AML CTF program that is the right fit for your club or clubs, conducting regular independent reviews, providing regular staff training, we talked about that at all levels, lodging your annual compliance report, making sure you've got evidence of procedures, and a culture of compliance. But really, the RSL and Services Clubs Association would encourage a beyond the ticket box exercise. So looking for that best practice where you can. Before we wrap up, any last words, Daniel or Damien, from yourselves?
No, that was a pretty good summary. But, we covered a lot, and it can be a little bit daunting, I guess. So I go back before I said originally that independent review, just let you know where you stand and what actions you need to go from there. It's probably the way I would go. But yeah.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I guess just understanding that requirements change, goalposts move. So, you know, I sat in on my first compliance assessment back in 2007, which I think was the first of any New South Wales club. And I've seen, having sat in on about 20 of these over time, where expectations change. So not becoming complacent and thinking, well, my program was compliant 3, 4, 5, even a year ago. Making sure you're continuously reviewing your risks, both from a business and a individual customer point of view. You're continuously reviewing and updating your program, and really having that evidence in place, I think, to be able to demonstrate to AUSTRAC in the event you are subject to a compliance assessment that not only does your program meet your obligations or meet the requirements, but you're meeting your program. I think that's really important as well. So continuing to review, continuing to update, continuing to retain that evidence rather than waiting until you've received a letter advising you're subject to a compliance assessment and thinking, oh, I better run around now and get all those evidence documents. Ideally, everything's there ready to go. That would be best case scenario, but not always possible. But really just putting systems in place to best prepare yourself.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you've got the processes and procedures in place, the evidence it's not a big task.
Sure.
Because it's your daily procedures, your weekly, your monthly, it's already embedded in there. So yeah.
Great. Okay, well, I'd like to thank you both. That was incredibly practical. I believe Clubs New South Wales also has a webinar next week with AUSTRAC, so I would encourage everyone to check that out. As I said, the RSL and Services Clubs Association advocates for a best practice approach to anti-money laundering and CTF, so I would encourage you to get on the front foot and be proactive, as Daniel said, but also look at that independent review and get a bit of a gap analysis of what you need to work on and really get on the front foot. So thank you for participating or coming along today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Evolve webinar. Thanks a lot.